I know you clicked for armor, but first let's talk about suits. There are three primary styles of men's tailoring in the Western world. The British style, known for its military-inspired, structured silhouettes. The Italian style, recognizable for its softer, more relaxed designs and effortless elegance. And the American style, focused on balancing comfort, practicality, and mass producibility. And within these categories, you get even more specific variations like Neapolitan versus Florentine, or Savile Row versus English country. Now, if you were to look at a blazer tailored in each of these styles, you may not immediately be able to tell the difference unless you knew what you were looking for. They all understand the structural rules of what a blazer is, and they follow the same design principles accordingly. But with a studied eye, you start to notice the little details that tell the story of each style's history and culture. So what if I told you that a suit of armor was much like a business suit? What if geographical and cultural differences also shaped the design of plate armor? Today we're undertaking the somewhat daunting task of defining and describing regional styles of Western European armor in the early Renaissance. What aesthetic details are unique to certain cultures? Which features are shared, suggesting universal design principles? And how does the region's broader influence, politically, economically, socially, affect the material culture of its neighbors? I mean, nothing could go wrong trying to smash a topic expansive enough for multiple PhD theses into one 20-minute video essay, right? Right. In order to discuss this topic with any sort of specificity, we necessarily have to limit the scope of the analysis. I'll be comparing the armor of 5 cultures: Germany, Italy, England, France, and Spain, while attempting to focus on styles orbiting the year 1480, give or take a decade. While there have been regional differences in armor for at least 100 years by the late 15th century, in my humble opinion, armor of this period blooms not only as military technology, but as a work of fashion and art. And as armor increasingly serves as a canvas for expression, so too does regional identity increasingly, if subtly, assert itself in its design. I will fully concede that for the sake of brevity and digestibility, I will be making sweeping generalizations within and between styles. My goal is not to enumerate every possible typology, nor collate every exception to broader trends. Surely there's a grad student out there willing to undertake that task. But to present a short list of major design features that are more commonly, if not necessarily exclusively, represented in specific regions. Consider this introduction to be a small step deeper into your study of Western European armor. Even more so, I hope you will find this to be a useful primer in training your eye to identify visual patterns, notice details, and interpret historical art. So with all of that in mind, let's get to the meat and potatoes. Now, it's important to acknowledge that Europe 600 years ago did not look like Europe today. Italy was not a unified nation, but still a collection of city-states. Germany was somewhere inside the Holy Roman Empire, which extended all the way from Brunswick to Siena. And Spain was still firmly split between Aragon and Castile. However, period sources attest the same regional identities that survived to the present day. In 1467, the Italian armorer Pietro de Gixulfis is hired to make armor in the Italian, French, Spanish, and German styles. So even then, the same cultural signifiers were in use, and even then, these regional tastes clearly applied to armor. So let's start our discussion with the most famous and most well documented of these styles, German and Italian. In modern discussions of 15th century armor, you will most often hear about German and Italian styles, often reductively called Gothic and Milanese respectively. Though Italian armorers beg you, stop giving Milan all the credit. They weren't the only ones to do this style. And there are several reasons for these two cultures' outsized presence in contemporary scholarship. One, the Holy Roman Empire and Italian city-states were renowned as major production centers of armor in the 15th century, and their work was widely exported across the continent. 2, we just happen to have a lot more surviving documentation of these armors in terms of extant pieces and artwork. And 3, these styles represent distinct design philosophies that lend themselves to easy identification as far as armors go. However, we have not widely adopted language rooted in aesthetics to describe these styles, so any discussion of visual patterns tends to fall back on nationality-centric handles. As a result, basically every style in Europe is described in terms of its relative Italianness or Germanness, but I propose that we add depth to this discussion by breaking down the visual design of armor through 3 lenses: volume, surface, and sensory experience. The first, volume. And we first have to establish that there are underlying design principles to European armor that are shared across cultures. Chiefly, certain elements of the armor have to be fitted to the body in order to be functional. A tight waist, for example, to support the weight of the harness, or arm and leg defenses that must have specific anatomical contours for optimal mobility and comfort. However, some armor components do not have to be so fitted, namely the pieces that are suspended from other parts of the armor rather than laying directly against the body. Couters, tassets, pole wings, and to some extent pauldrons, for example. And so we see the Italian style really playing with the design flexibility of these pieces by expanding volume. Tall placards that rise nearly to the neck, wide coverage pauldrons and its extensions like the hot piece, oversized couters, mitten gauntlets that flare at the wrist and extend almost to the elbow. Together, these features exaggerate the wearer's proportions to give the impression of a very robust upper body. By contrast, German armors of the 1480s seem very interested in reducing volume to closely adhere to the shape of the body. Gauntlets that emphasize the anatomy of the hand and sculpt to the arm. Short folds and tall cuisses that lengthen the leg. All of these features create a very long, slender, and streamlined silhouette. One possible explanation for these different approaches could be rooted in male beauty standards of each culture. When we look at period artworks of men in states of undress, usually religious figures getting stabbed a whole bunch, it seems to me that Italian depictions may more often depict men with broader shoulders and chests, for example. Whereas the German depictions are definitely not hitting that calorie surplus, I tell you what. The Dorito versus the ruler body type, shall we say. Though we'd need more research to say with confidence. It may just have easily been the result of divergent evolution in stylistic convention. So let's talk about our second lens, surface. The Italian style is characterized by plain, smooth surfaces. German by elaborate fluting and cut-out ornamentation. One could say that the Italian aesthetic emphasizes simple elegance and geometry of the form, while the German style pushes decorative techniques in tandem with functional features, often explicitly mimicking textile fashion in its design. But in addition to analyzing the design of an armor in stillness, we would do well to consider its impression in motion. And so let's move to our last lens, the sensory experience of fighting in and against the armor. Italian armor tended to include more mail, large loose sleeves that overhung the upper cannons, small strips called valances suspended underneath the pollanes, and dual-layered skirts beneath the falds. You can imagine how these must have swished, gleamed, and clattered against the harness with movement, generating sight and sound while riding and fighting. But as we've discussed, the German design aesthetic seems concerned with creating the impression of a man made of steel, with almost no independent movement in the harness. They tend to wear braillettes more often than other European regions, which are these male booty shorts that definitely don't have material for swishing. And eventually even tassets start phasing out from late 15th century hip defenses. I wonder if these differences might be subconscious expressions of cultural identity. Germany has had a reputation for efficiency even as far back as the Middle Ages, with their specialized centers of production like the watchmakers of Mainz or the armorers of Solingen. In fact, the 15th century master of arms Pietromonte wrote, "In Germany and Flanders, almost everyone is phlegmatic and color usually follows." Today we might describe that person as reserved, conscientious, and direct. By contrast, the Italians are sanguine and phlegmatic in complexion. In other words, enthusiastic, active, and decisive. Not to treat 500-year-old stereotypes as fact, but I do think it's interesting how these attitudes map to the stillness and dynamism of German and Italian armors respectively. So are you ready for a pop quiz to test what you've learned? Guess whose regional style? It's German!
Es tut mir leid.
I hope you guessed correctly from the slender silhouette, those reduced volumes we discussed. And looking at the surface, we also see the signature fluted elements and cutout decoration that signal this armor's origin. And lastly, not a lot of movement in the form of dangly pieces. One additional detail we haven't discussed yet is the shape of the helmet. The style of helmet, called a sallet, was widely used across Europe in 1480, but each culture developed their own interpretation. The Germans in particular loved to exaggerate the length of the tail and even sometimes articulate it, which is very consistent with their overall design language of long and slender shapes. So let's try another example. How about this one? I'll give you a second to think about it. Seconds up. If you said Italian, you'd be right. Let's go through our checklist. For volume, note the oversized couters, which you can tell from this angle just by how much space there is inside of the form. Also, these hot pieces, which are the vertical protrusions on pauldrons, are quite common on Italian armors. While they do serve a functional purpose in deflecting blows away from the throat, they also contribute to the exaggeration of the upper body. We do see a few hot pieces on German armors in 1480, but they're nowhere near as common. And in fact, German armors sometimes dispense with pauldrons entirely in favor of spalders, which are more minimal shoulder defenses that just cover the deltoid rather than the pec. For surface, I hope you noted the smooth mirror polish of the plates as opposed to the ornate details of our previous German friend. And for movement, we're seeing the signature mail sleeves, tassets over a two-tiered skirt, and valances beneath the knees. Another specifically Italian detail here is how the tall placard flattens at the top rather than having the pointed peak the way that many other styles of European armor do. You'll also notice this strap at the throat. Italian cuirasses are typically constructed in the hinged style rather than the front and back style. That basically means that there's a shorter torso piece of the cuirass that comes to about the ribs, which sits inside of the placard, which is constructed as a separate piece that covers the abdomen. By contrast, the front and back style is integrated such that it comes apart in two halves. We see this construction a lot more frequently in German armors. Bonus round! Now this one is a little mean because this is actually a somewhat hybrid style that modern scholarship has termed Alla Tedesca. It refers to armor that may have German-style surface ornamentation but Italian construction. We're not quite sure whether these armors were typically Italian-made with German influence or German-made with Italian influence, but the end result is that we have a genre of armors that are a little bit halfway between. Now that we've become comfortable with analyzing these armors through our three lenses, I just want to note that I propose these not to necessarily replace nationality-based description of armor, because those handles can still be very useful in tracing cultural influence across Europe. But I think honing in on aesthetic decision-making specifically helps break us out of that rigid geopolitical framework and gets us thinking about these objects as the works of art that they are. So let's talk about the rest of Western Europe using a combined approach of regional signifiers and design thinking. To discuss England, I will now be shamelessly cribbing from Toby Capwell's Armor of the English Knight trilogy, which you should absolutely read if you want a more in-depth look at English armor in the 15th century. But taking it from the top, let's talk about helmets. Unfortunately, the trouble with studying English armor is that a significant amount of our surviving evidence comes from effigies, which a lot of the time don't actually show us a helmet or even the back of the armor for that matter. Nevertheless, in 1480s England, we do have evidence of a regional style of sallet distinguished by this pointed apex and fluted details. We'll see this design language of sharp points and spiral surface design echoed throughout the other parts of the armor. Moving to the arms and torso, this chevron-like fluting appears again on the upper cannon and in gauntlets and cuffs, along with these big, pointy, fluted counters. This sharp, swirling motif echoes in the layered elements of the armor as well, where we commonly see these scalloped edges on the placard and lames of the falls and pull-ins. Segmented placards of 2 or even 3 pieces appear to be more common in England, France, and Spain than in Germany or Italy. And one of the perhaps most English features is these really long folds which extend almost all the way to the crotch. They share a similar shape to Italian folds perhaps, but tend to have more lames and travel further down the hips. You'll notice that the tassets are still attached at more or less the same level as they are in armors with shorter folds, with the tips hitting just below the hip crease. But unlike other regional styles, the tassets overlap the folds by quite a bit. In the legs, we seem to see more closed creases than we do in other regions, which Dr. Capwell proposes may be a reflection of the English preference for fighting on foot. It seems logical that a closed crease would be much more uncomfortable to fight in on horseback, to say nothing of being a little bit unnecessary, given that the back of your thigh is going to be against your horse. However, we do see closed creases elsewhere in 15th century Europe, so it must have had some appeal outside of the specific English context. So now that you have the broadest overview of English armor, let's move on to France and Spain, where I think you'll find that there are a lot of similarities. Now I gotta be honest here, there is not yet a ton of English language scholarship on French and Spanish armors specifically, so I fear I will not be able to comment on these with as much authority as I feel we could muster for German, Italian, or even English armor that has more study. That said, if you've made it this far, we've been familiarizing ourselves with other styles of European armor and practicing our analysis of subtle differences. So why don't we take a look at some examples of French and Spanish armors and see if we can start to observe some patterns and maybe begin to form a hypothesis. Let's start with France. Now, our constraint in studying French armor is that almost nothing from the 15th century survives, so our greatest source of information is from manuscripts, which are not always super high fidelity portrayals. Further, the manuscripts we have tend to come from the same small group of workshops, so we don't have the greatest diversity of sources to draw complete conclusions from. Nevertheless, let us try our best with what we have. Overall, French armor is fairly similar to the English style, even into the late 15th century, which is no wonder given how closely their history is intertwined. When you've been fighting each other since the mid-14th century over which cousin will be king, your armors will have naturally developed to share some similarities. But by 1480, the two styles had had 30 years to subtly diverge since the end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453. So let's talk about a few key features that could be distinctly French. Taking a broad brush, one thing I immediately notice is the preponderance of covered breastplates. These are often mistaken as brigandine, but what is actually happening here is that decorative fabric covers the main plate of the cuirass, while the placard comes over the top. Like the English, they do seem to share these scalloped details in the peaks of the placard, in the limbs of the falds, and in the tassets. Also like the English, they do seem to love a pointed sallet. However, while they share the short tails and tall apexes, French sallets don't appear to as commonly feature fluted details, unlike their English counterparts. We also see a lot of these round rondels on the side of the head in French helmets. Now, this might be source bias. It does appear to be correlated with lower-ranking soldiers, and it might just be the stylistic convention of the particular workshop who created the miniature. But I find it quite interesting, since this is actually a bit of an older feature. These rondels pop up in English and German art from some 40 to 60 years earlier. Similarly, we seem to see more great bassinets than we do elsewhere in 1480. This too was a style of helmet that was kind of on its way out by the tail end of the 15th century. So whether or not these helmet designs were an artistic signifier of outdated or historical equipment, or genuinely just a living preference for the French in the later 15th century, I can't really say for sure. But now that I've introduced more questions than answers, let's talk about Spain. As with England and France, we have another source constraint. In Spain, our well of armor in art is mostly composed of depictions of armored saints, typically Saint Michael. This poses a problem because saints are gonna be bougie. Saint Michael has immaculate drip, from these lavish capes to gilt everything. So we have to separate embellishments that might signify holiness or status from the image of armor that might actually be in use at this time. But here's what we can say. We see a really interesting mix of influences in Spanish armor that reflects Spain's interactions with regions across Europe. England, France, and Spain were each embroiled in the Hundred Years' War and the Castilian Civil War, for example, and Spain and Italy shared a close cultural exchange through the Aragonese dynasty in Naples. So we see many similarities in design among these cultures, but perhaps enhanced with a unique Spanish flair. Like the English and French, they really seem to have embraced this pointy, highly scalloped, and thoroughly fluted design language. They also developed a similar pointy-topped helmet, more of a kettle hat than a sallet, which may have been a progenitor of the later Mauryan style. And like Italy, they also wear wide mail sleeves over their upper cannons, layered mail skirt beneath the falls. We do have a surviving example of Spanish armor from the late 15th century made for Ferdinand V, which offers us an interesting case study. It is, generally speaking, very Italianate in its design, with its smooth surfaces and expanded volumes. This choice might suggest to us that Spanish royalty was perhaps interested in adopting a more popular, continental style at court, rather than appearing provincial with a more local design. But as ever, hard to say without more data points. Forgive me for omitting Portugal in our discussion here. I know they're like the westest you can get in Western Europe, but I frankly just haven't been able to find enough sources to draw a good conclusion. The visual sources that we do have seem to suggest a similarly spiky design language to Spain, but I don't want to say anything conclusive with such a small sample. I've also been informed that I can't skip Flanders, because Hans Memling is like a huge source of armor in art or something. What I'll say for now is that Flemish armor is an interesting blend of Italian and German influences. Overall, it borrows heavily from the unadorned surfaces and overall shapes of contemporary Italian styles, but with the reduced volumes of German designs to achieve the same sleek and slender silhouette. Now, even after we have spent the last 20 minutes looking for cultural difference, I think it's important to note that culture doesn't have borders. The real world isn't like a video game where you take 5 steps to the right and abruptly load an entire new setting. People move, people talk to each other, people learn from each other. And so often the lines of cultural identity are not so clear-cut. And yet people treasure their nationalities and express them as a source of pride or a signifier of belonging. So what I hope you gain from this video is how even the smallest design details tell a story. How minute details embed identity into even the most functional of objects, reflecting the experiences and values of the people who use them. As always, thanks for watching. I make videos about fashion and material culture with a special emphasis on armor, and I also design clothes that look like armor. So if that sounds like your kind of special interest jamboree, I hope you'll stick around, like, subscribe, and maybe support my work on Ko-fi. Till next time, stay shiny.